Coming up on this episode of Seahawks Forever, from Seahawks on SI and Locked on Seahawks, Connor Benintendi will join me today. He's doing such a great job over there as part of Corbin Smith's team. And he said something on the podcast recently that caught my ear. He was emphatic about who he believes the best player is on the Seahawks. Do you know who I'm talking about? We'll see if you agree or disagree with his thoughts. He'll make his case coming up next. We'll also talk about how good he thinks the offense can be and get his thoughts on the Giants matchup coming up in just 2 days. Stick around. This is Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
Shout out to the folks at Bet US. This episode brought to you by them. So as I mentioned, was listening to Locked on Seahawks the other day, and Connor said something that made my ears perk up, and I thought it was a conversation worth having. I thought you would enjoy it, whether you agree with it or not. Can't wait to get your thoughts on that. Before we do that, there is some news today. Brian Daboll, head coach of the New York Giants, confirming that star rookie wide receiver Malik Nabers will not be good to go. I mentioned on the live show last night that it was unlikely he would make it through concussion protocol, given that he was in such early stages of it. And there just wasn't enough time, even with the extended week as the Giants played last Thursday, for him to be able to get ramped up to full football activities. So the Giants will be shorthanded. And we'll find out today about their running back, Devin Singletary. Daboll says he's going to try to give that groin injury a go. We're going to have him practice today. We'll get more clarity on that after that practice is wrapped up today. And for all the focus on Nabers, man, if Singletary can't go, even with him in the backfield, the Giants averaging less than 4 yards per carry on the ground. Let's get into this. Connor is new to the team over there. But I think after this conversation, you're going to agree with me that he's doing some really great work. He's a really cool addition to the Seahawks content creation universe. So here's my conversation with him. Get ready. Maybe write this down, who you think we're talking about, and then let me know in the comments afterwards if you were right or not. Here's Connor. All right, you guys, joining me from All Seahawks and Locked on Seahawks, Connor Benintendi. Did I say that right?
You got it right.
At the second N in there. I'm just happy that I didn't call you Andrew. We were talking about the Major League Baseball player there, but no, love the work you're doing over there on Locked On, and great addition to Corbin's team. Corbin's been a friend of mine and a friend of the show for a long time, so it's a good time to have you on, especially in light of something you said that caught my ear. I was at the gym listening to Locked On the other day, and I'd heard people discuss these terms in a general sense, but you were the first one that really came out and said it the most definitively. If I were to ask you right now who the best player, regardless of position, is on the Seattle Seahawks, what's your answer?
It's Geno Smith. I think it has to be at this point with what Geno's doing on the field. All of the metrics back it up, Dan, and I think that is one of the biggest things that we're not fully looking at yet. I actually wrote about this yesterday. A piece went up this morning about his MVP candidacy. I don't think he's a front runner right now, but he's going to be in that conversation. He's going to be in that conversation by the way that he's playing right now. And I just don't think that there's anybody who's more valuable to this football team right now than Geno Smith.
Have you felt this way for a while, or is this a product of how he's played the first 4 weeks?
Look, before I was a Seahawks media member, as right we somewhat call it loosely, I suppose. Whenever Geno beat Denver in 2022 at home and made his famous quote, I immediately bought his jersey. Okay, and that was when I was still a fan, entirely a fan at the time. I immediately bought his jersey. I went to a couple more games that season. I was rocking his jersey. I just felt different about Geno, and it wasn't something that was so far disconnected from what Russ brought us, which Russ brought excellence all the time. He brought stability. He brought wins, right? We hardly ever saw a bad football product be put on the field whenever Russell Wilson was Seattle's quarterback. But Geno just brought this different edge, and he brought something fresh. He brought something new. It was exciting, obviously, especially to beat Denver at home to open the season. And then everything he did that season, right? He goes on, he sets the single season passing yards record in his first year as the starter. He throws 30 touchdown passes. I mean, Russell only did that a couple seasons. Obviously, his career high was 40, and that was an incredible year in 2020, even though he trailed off a little bit.
Yeah.
But to really get to the meat of your question there, Dan, I have felt that way for a long time. I've always been very bullish on Geno as Seattle's quarterback. Now, I will say I have had I've wavered a little bit on whether he's the long-term quarterback, okay? Because obviously he's about to be 34 years old.
Right.
That's been the biggest thing that I've questioned through his 3 years starting for Seattle. But this year, I just, you see how fast he is, how agile he is, the way he's able to evade pressure. He's able to run 20 miles per hour in the open field. This guy does not play like a 33-year-old quarterback. And I really don't think there's 10 other quarterbacks or more who are playing better football than him right now, especially and the metrics back it up. And we're going to get into that. But that's just really where I've been. And this last game against Detroit, I think it was about midway through that game where I just said, this is the best football game I've ever seen Geno play. And I'm not seeing anybody else on the field right now who is contributing more to what Seattle is doing on the football field than what Geno Smith is doing.
It's interesting. I've been on Team Geno for a long time. I think, like you, it didn't take very long into the 2022 season for me to figure out that, okay, this guy's legitimate. The talent that got him drafted as high as he was, and that caused the Jets to think that he could be their franchise quarterback back then. The talent is legitimate, as is usually the case with a lot of these quarterbacks that don't end up living up to their potential or their reputation just because of situational, or they just didn't get the right opportunity or injuries or what have you. And then as time went on, I've only become more of a believer. And for me, it was about halfway through last season. When you go back and look at the last 7 games of last season, Geno Smith played as well as any quarterback in the NFL at a time when everything else on that team was falling to pieces. He was the only thing that gave us a chance to win on a week in, week out basis. And I look at that Pittsburgh game in particular, when there were not only execution issues all over on defense, but effort issues too for the first time. I feel like that Pittsburgh game might've been the final nail in Pete Carroll's coffin. Something clicked for him last year. And then the marriage this year of Ryan Grubb and Geno Smith in that system just seems to be hand in glove. And in fact, Grubb says yesterday, he says, Geno's elite. He's special. He believes that. When you talk about other quarterbacks in the league and where he fits, I think that's where a lot of this conversation can get off track a little bit. He still has his detractors. Where would you place him on that list if you were building a list of guys that you would take over Geno if you could trade him 1-to-1? About how large would that group be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I like that you ask it, because honestly, I haven't really thought about it. I think of Geno in such a vacuum for some reason. Like I try not to place him. I'm going to do it because I want to answer your question, but I've tried kind of not to place him in a specific spot. He's certainly in the top 10. He's certainly in the top 10. Like I said, I don't think there are 10 quarterbacks playing better football than Geno Smith, and especially the advanced metrics show that. I think I'd place him right around 8 to 9. I think it's in that is the kind of that sweet spot, at least this year. Is he going to be that for 5 more years? I don't know, right? Like I do feel a lot more confident about him being the quarterback for 3 to 4 more years. But I think once you get into that 5 and beyond, you get into those near 40-year-old age seasons.
Yeah.
That's where we start to say, okay, well, how much, and those are the eye test things that we can see. Like right now, people rely so much on metrics, and I do as well, just to mostly back up what I'm seeing with my eyes, right? But when we get to that point, we're also going to have to look at, okay, is he still playing at the same high level? What are even the circumstances around him? Because right now, I think that this football team is ascending to be a playoff and Super Bowl contender. Corbin and I have talked about this on some other videos we've done for Seahawks on SI and things. And one was what are the prospects of trading for Bryce Young? Like, would that be something that's viable for this team? And I think the immediate thing is no, because you have a roster that's ready to contend for the playoffs. And if you took a quarterback who has very little success in the NFL and plopped him there, all of a sudden you've messed up all of the contracts that you have and the timing on the contracts and where those are going to add up for needing to pay guys to where your Super Bowl window closes. Right now, you have the best Super Bowl window available to you with Geno Smith.
Geno still has his critics. He has a lot of detractors out there. We heard it a lot in the offseason because, as you and I were talking about before I hit record, we weren't getting any new information. So whatever opinion you had about Geno Smith in the offseason wasn't going to be changed, no matter what numbers you might cherry pick or try to throw at someone to make your argument. Why? But the people that don't believe in Geno are vehement about it. You see it on Twitter. You see it on social media. It doesn't matter what he does at some point. Some of those people aren't going to change their minds. Why do you think that is?
I think it's just the past image. It's the past image. You have a guy who's been accused of, when he was with the Jets, getting punched in the face over a plane ticket or whatever it was, right? Like you have this image. It's the same thing. It's the same thing where you have Sam Darnold balling out right now, Dan, and everybody's still going to say, well, he's Sam Darnold, right? And Sam Darnold's going to have that chip on his shoulder for years to come, in my opinion, even if he continues to play well, even if he's a viable either high-end backup or mid-end starting quarterback, whatever it is. I think that quarterbacks just get labeled so fast, especially if you're drafted high, right? And we talk about it now where there's perception of, like, where you're drafted is a huge perspective changer on a quarterback, right? Like you have Brock Purdy for the 49ers, who's picked last in the draft. And you have a lot of people who are saying, okay, well, he's not getting the credit he's due because he was a low draft pick. But if he was the first overall pick, people would be saying he's the best quarterback in the league, right? Yeah. So perception changes entirely based on, and I know Geno was a second round pick, but things were a little bit different back then on where some of these guys were getting drafted. And I know Geno wasn't happy about where he got drafted. But so the short answer to your question, Dan, I think is just the past perception. And people had a preconceived notion for almost 10 years about who Geno Smith was. Geno Smith was a bust. Geno Smith was a bad teammate. Geno Smith didn't produce for the New York Jets. He flopped out of the Big Apple, right? So then he goes and becomes a starting quarterback elsewhere. What are you going to do? You're going to expect that to be the case. And I just don't think he will ever fully shake it, even if he's playing at an MVP level.
God, you make some good points there. And I'm so glad you brought up Sam Darnold, because it occurs to me that, like, I feel like just 4 days into this season, the people have been incredibly quick to turn their opinion around about Sam Darnold and accept him and talk about how he's, well, I guess I was wrong about him. He's legit. But Sam Darnold was a top 5 draft pick. Mm-hmm. Smith slipped into the second round, even though there was some expectation before that draft that he might be a first round pick. And then he bounced around a little bit more. Darnold did too. But, he was with Shanahan and now he's with O'Connell. And there's, again, you talk about that word perception, like, well, if Shanahan likes him, if O'Connell likes him, then there must be something to him. Whereas Geno, it didn't work out in New York, although he played much better his second season. If you go back and look at that tape, there's some good stuff there. You can see some of the stuff that translates to what he's doing now. And then he hurts his knee and then he bounced around a little bit and gets that journeyman tag. But who did he play behind? A whole bunch of Hall of Famers, right? He was in New York behind Eli Manning. He was with the Chargers behind Phillip Rivers, and then obviously behind Russell Wilson here. 7 one-year contracts. I think that once you get it in your head that a guy isn't a good player, and also, well, he was drafted in the second round, there must be something wrong with him. Like, you can go buy a used car that looks cherry to you. There's not a spot on it. It's got low miles. Everything looks great. What's wrong with it, though? How come this person wants to sell it, right? There's just that little seed of doubt in your head. It's interesting to me. What do you think it will take from here forward for some of those undecided voters, to use a topical term, to maybe finally change their minds and be convinced? What does Geno need to do?
First, he needs to stop getting really unlucky interceptions. That's number one. I mean, three of them 3 of them were unlucky. One of them, the one that went off of Zach Charbonnet's hands near the goal line and got intercepted, I put that entirely on Geno. That's just not a good play. So I'm not going to make an excuse for him on that one. But people just look at stats, as we've already touched on, Dan. People look at stats. They want to see a high touchdown to interception ratio.
Right.
They want to see a lot of passing yards, and especially the voters who do not watch the Seahawks every single week, like that's especially important, right? Because they're just going to say, okay, I haven't watched Geno play a whole lot. Let me go look at his numbers. And you just go back to Russell Wilson in 2020, whenever he had, I think it was like 15 touchdowns to 1 interception over the first 4 or 5 games.
Right.
And then he trailed off. And then you had Aaron Rodgers, who threw 48 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. Who's going to win the MVP? Of course, Aaron Rodgers is going to win the MVP because he's playing in Green Bay. He's a popular figure, and his touchdown to interception ratio is godlike. So I think Geno could play out of his mind, and all of us in Seattle could fully understand that. And if the stats don't look like some other quarterbacks in the league, he's not going to stand a chance in the MVP conversation. But, you know, even though I wrote a story about where he stands in the MVP conversation, Dan, I really hate MVP discussions this early. I think the only reason I had to do it was because he was so low in the odds. And it's like, okay, this is kind of crazy. I'm not going to make a case for anybody this early to be a legitimate MVP front runner or, you know, in the MVP conversation. But I think it really just comes down to the numbers. As much as I hate that, because I think we should all be watching football players and judging football players based off of how they play football rather than what they put in a box score. But I think that's really what would have to change.
Yeah, it's kind of like the college football playoff discussion. Like they made the decision to not release those rankings till halfway through the season. Maybe we don't start talking about MVP until we've got 7 or 8 games in the bank. Yeah. I think you're right. That touchdown interception ratio right now is an issue for some people. It's certainly holding his passer rating back. He's at 92.1, I think, right now. I was playing around with the calculator this morning. If you just change that to if you take it, because I agree with you on those interceptions. The one in the end zone was bad. He should have thrown it away, thrown it at his feet, buried it, taken the intentional grounding, whatever. That was a terrible play on his part, and he would admit it. I think he did. The other 3, he was affected by late pressure, and he was trying to make a play and had guys wide open down the field, just wasn't able to complete the throw because he was compromised by pressure. But if you go 2 fewer interceptions, his passer rating jumps 5.5 points. If you go 8 touchdown passes to 4, his passer rating goes to almost 100, which would put him in the top 10. And while someone might say, you know, well, where are those touchdowns going to come from? Are they magically going to appear? The Seahawks have 8 rushing touchdowns from running backs this year. 7. I'm sorry. 1 was from Geno, which you have to give him credit for, right?
Yeah, you do.
7 rushing touchdowns. They're getting into the red zone, and then they're cashing in with running. He could have easily, you know, the play to DK on Monday that had to be reviewed, you know, it was damn near a touchdown. And it's too bad that it wasn't, because it was a great play. And I wish he had gotten that. I think the touchdowns are going to come. You know, somebody on Twitter last night posted, you know, that he's on pace for 5,000 yards and this completion percentage and 17 touchdowns, 17 interceptions. That's not what his final stat line is going to look like.
No.
You know, I think he's going to be over 30 touchdowns. I think he's going to reduce the interceptions. When talking stats, because I know you mentioned that you're into that, if you were to take a couple of your favorite metrics and things that you use to judge a quarterback's performance in the context of his team's performance, what would you point to first to try to make your case?
Yeah, that's a great point. I love turnover worthy play rate. That's one of my first ones, just because it goes to show, like, there was a time, I think, where Geno had 3 interceptions and he had 1 turnover worthy play. Yeah. I don't quote me on that, but I think I remember seeing that. And right now he's 10th in the NFL at just 2.4% of his throws are a turnover worthy play. I also love adjusted completion percentage, just because when you break that down, you're taking the wide receivers completely out of it. You're putting it as, where is the quarterback putting the ball? Did he put it in a place that is catchable for an NFL receiver, which, to go back to the old moniker of, if it hits your hands, you got to catch it, right? Like that's even more true in the NFL than in any other league. So those 2 are really good. I really do like EPA per play as well. Not to sound too cliche there, because EPA gets thrown around all the time now to where it's almost ad nauseum.
Sure.
And that's one where it actually goes against Geno because he's only at 0.07 right now, and that ranks 14th. And I did see another tweet the other day talking about how Geno has always kind of underperformed in EPA per play, which is interesting. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. I wish I had an explanation for it.
Yeah.
But I think it partially comes from what you said of the running back touchdowns. And obviously, he's not always going to be the one who is putting the ball in the end zone whenever they enter the red zone, right? And to go also full circle back to the initial thing, I think you could really make an argument that some of these running backs are more valuable than Geno, but I think that they don't even get to the red zone to where the running backs are a viable option if Geno's not the quarterback, right? So that's a big thing to look at. One of my favorite ones, I mean, I like big time throw rate, Dan, but I feel like it's so much more subjective maybe than some of these other ones. It really can waver here and there. And Geno has actually his lowest big time throw rate so far of his Seattle stint right now. And I think that's a lot because of the running backs, and because of his surrounding cast. And he hasn't had to make so many of those.
I have another theory on that too. And this isn't mine. I don't take credit for it. I can't give credit. I can't remember who said this, but it was just in the last couple of days. And you touched on it, but for a different reason. He hasn't had to make as many big time throws because for the first time, I think in over a decade, the Seahawks have a play caller and an offensive coordinator that is capable of and showing he can scheme receivers open. His big time throw percentage isn't as high as it has been in the past because he hasn't had to make those because receivers are open and he's finding them.
I could not agree more with that. I think that's actually a perfect summary of why exactly it is. And probably you said it a lot better than I could have. So I appreciate that, Dan, because really, I think that's exactly what it is. He's not having, obviously Caleb Williams and the Chicago Bears are not the exact offense and scheme
right.
that Shane Waldron went over there with. But look at the type of throws that Caleb Williams is having to make right now in Chicago. Nothing is coming easy for Caleb Williams. And that's partially because of his offensive line. Right? Offensive line there is also terrible in pass pro, but Geno Smith has, at least per Pro Football Focus, has the 28th ranked offensive line. Right. And he's still doing what he's doing. His pressure to sack ratio is off the charts. Geno's of his 11 sacks, the 11 sacks that Geno has actually been sacked, only one of those has actually been credited as Geno's fault per Pro Football Focus, because he's more often than not, he's evading them, really is the biggest thing. And his pressure to sack percentage is at 15.9%, which ranks 9th in the NFL.
That's the area that I think Geno has taken the biggest step in. And to the point that I would say Geno is not only elite in how he manages himself in the pocket and senses pressure and moves around and manipulates the pocket and manages it, especially considering that he's facing a higher rate of pressure than most quarterbacks in the league. But I would also argue he's the best in the league at it and has been since Tom Brady retired. Like that was Brady's thing, right? But the way that Geno can sense it coming, move around, just slide a little bit so he can get his arm free so he can make a full throw. If anyone doubts what I'm saying right now and thinks I'm crazy, do yourself a favor, spend the $14 or whatever it is to get 1 month of the NFL Pro, the film room, the new feature that they came out with this year. Go back and look at the Pittsburgh Steelers game on all 22, and you can just filter it by Geno Smith passing plays. So you can just watch him, bam, bam, bam. Watch how many times in that game he had to move around to get away from TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith and the guys that were coming at him on a regular basis, and keep them in that game when they had no business being in that game. It's remarkable. It really is. And it's a sustainable skill. It's one of those things that he has, despite the fact that the offensive line has struggled at times to protect him. And that even when they keep him clean, as they did for the most part on Monday, he's still, like Connor Williams is getting pushed back in the pocket. There are very few times where he gets to set his feet and just scan the field. And to your point on turnover worthy throws, I was looking at that same metric this morning, and I made a list of guys that are worse and that have significantly more turnover worthy throws on the season. Hurts, Herbert, Cousins, Allen, Stafford, Mahomes, Burrow, Murray, Darnold. It's not a bad list, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those are quarterbacks that most fans would say are better than Geno.
Yeah, right. Like that's supposed to be your elite tier of quarterbacks, right?
Yeah. Now let's talk about money. Because we talked about the the idea of him sticking around.
Mhm.
And I'm on the same boat with you. You know, I don't think it's going to happen during the season, although it wouldn't shock me. But I would be at this point, unless something goes completely off the rails or there's an injury involved. I would fully expect that that's going to be one of the big priorities for Seattle in the offseason is extending Geno.
Yeah, I think it has to be too. I mean,
Yeah.
at this point, he's only under contract through next season. And if he continues to play this well, you're going to have, trust me, the NFL teams are not of the same opinion. I mean, not like I have insight with NFL teams, but I can guarantee you this, that they view Geno like we do rather than like some of these other detractors do. He's been that good, and you will have a quarterback needy team who maybe has had a recent failed rookie or whatever it might be. Just they're in sort of that quarterback desert right now that has enough cap room to pay Geno Smith $50 million a year. There's going to be one. And
Daniel Jeremiah said that on Seattle Sports 2 days ago, and
Yeah.
he posed it as a question, and he took a lot of heat for that from, fans that don't believe in Geno. But it's amazing to me that people are so quick to dismiss the fact that Daniel Jeremiah is not just a talking head. He's not just a media figure. He has worked in front offices. He has written scouting reports. He has been in war rooms and draft rooms on a professional level. He's as good at what he does in the media as anyone because he has a legitimate background. So when he says, maybe Carolina should think about if you were available, don't you think they would consider bringing Geno in after failing multiple times on high draft pick quarterbacks? And, and he has Dave Canales there. Obviously, there's that connection, and they have the cap space. And he throws the $50 million figure out there, and people freak out.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the list of $50 and $40 million quarterbacks, and Geno's cap hit next year would be about $40 million, depending on some escalators, which, that's a fluid situation. I mean, these are just some of the guys making 40 already. Daniel Jones, Matt Stafford, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes. I'm going up the list, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Kirk Cousins, Deshaun Watson, Kyler Murray, Jalen Hurts, Jackson, Herbert, Goff, Tagovailoa, Burrow, Lawrence, Love, Prescott, right? Well, you're not going to get one of those guys. If you don't believe in Geno and you want a better quarterback, you're not going to get one of those guys. They're not available. I used to have this argument with my dad all the time who hated Matt Hasselbeck, and I would make him list the other quarterbacks he'd want, and he would, and then I'd say, how are you going to get those guys? Because they're not on the market, right? So then, just draft a guy. Okay. So if you were one of those that wanted the Seahawks to take Anthony Richardson at 5 instead of Devin Witherspoon a year ago, and for a moment I was one of them, how would you feel about that decision now? How's that playing out, right?
Right.
Bryce Young, how's that playing out?
Yep.
Right. The bust rate on quarterbacks is immense. And so what I look at, let's talk about something topical. How good was Kirk Cousins last night? How good does he look in Atlanta? And how good of a move does that look, regardless of how you feel about what they did in the first round, for them to get him? And they look like a legitimate contender, right? Like
Absolutely.
Kirk Cousins might be playing some of his best football.
Yeah.
Well,
torn Achilles.
Right. And he's at $45 million a year in average annual value. It's, if you don't think Geno Smith's good, but you think Kirk Cousins is good, that loses me.
I agree. I mean, the one question I would ask is, would you rather have Trevor Lawrence or would you rather have Geno Smith?
Yeah.
I mean, look at the contract that the Jaguars just gave Trevor Lawrence. And guess what? You know why they did that? It's because they fear having to hit the reset button.
Right.
And like and I fear that for the Seahawks hitting the reset button with where this roster's at, right? I touched on it a little bit earlier. This roster is to where you are maybe one or two moves, one or two key pieces away. Maybe not even that. Maybe you just need the pieces that are in Seattle already to continue to elevate, right? That
Sure.
might be the case as well. But they're right there. And we're gonna see how the rest of the season plays out. I think that there is legitimate postseason contention. The big, I think, litmus test. I kind of hate throwing that around because obviously Mike McDonald doesn't like using that term either, as he said post game. But more so than the Lions game because of all the injuries and things like that and how that was affecting the game. If Seattle gets healthy for week 6 versus the 49ers, and the 49ers are relatively healthy, that's going to be the real, okay, where are we at, right? Because that's been the big hurdle of we can feel really good about a Seahawks team, and then they go play the 49ers and get absolutely stomped. And that's pretty much been the way it's been since 2021, I should say.
And
So,
I think I asked you earlier what you felt like Geno needed to do to change some minds. I think he lacks a signature win. And if we lose on Thursday Night Football next week, even if he plays relatively well, which he's played better against the 49ers in a couple of those games than people give him credit for, I think that the narrative's not going to change until he beats them. And then the next step would be getting a playoff win, because that's the first thing people throw at you too. So that's a big one that's looming coming up in the near future, I think.
it is going to be his birthday too. So that's
right. October 10th, right?
So that's also a plus.
Maybe
he gets some birthday juice, or maybe if he loses, everybody decides to say, "Oh, he's 34 now, so let's get rid of him."
Right.
Let's hope that's not the case.
See, that's why I knew that I liked him right away, because he's a Libra, just like yours truly.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and just to throw the age thing out there, we're talking about Kirk Cousins, because I think that's the comp for me.
Yeah,
that's the comp. If you're willing to pay Kirk Cousins this, and that's what his value is in the league, then I'm willing to pay Geno Smith that, because, oh, by the way, Geno's 3 years younger. Kirk Cousins is contracted with the Falcons through his age 39 season.
Right.
Speaking of Geno Smith, he is featured prominently in some of the prop bets over on BetUS for this Giants matchup on Sunday. Passing yards over 248.5 yards at -111. Rushing yards over 10.5. Do you like that one? Do you like him to use his legs a little bit against the Giants? And will DK Metcalf be his favored receiving target once again? The over-under on his receiving yards for this game, 65.5. And then a little sneak peek ahead to Thursday Night Football. The 49ers, a 3-point favorite on BetUS as we sit here today. Head on over there and sign up for your new account today. If you do that, BetUS will give you a 150% sign-up bonus on your first deposit, 125% on your second and third deposits, up to $2,000. Use promo code YouTube150 at BetUS. And if you enjoy the feel of a professional shave, but you don't want to wait weeks for an appointment, you can do it in your own home now, thanks to the folks over at Manscaped, liked and trusted by over 11 million men worldwide. Their newest innovation, the Chairman Pro Electric Foil Shaver. Whether you like that baby smooth, luxurious, clean cut feel, or you like a little 5 o'clock shadow or stubble, you can accomplish that with the Chairman Pro. And right now, Manscaped is giving you one heck of a deal. Head on over there to manscaped.com. They'll give you 20% off and free shipping with the promo code Seahawks. So you talked about, maybe how much better it can get. And we're talking offensive line, right? Like we need some clarity on right tackle. We need some clarity on right guard. I had hoped to hear a little bit different narrative this week after the way Christian Haynes played. And I know Corbin did a great write-up yesterday on breaking down all the drives that Bradford played versus Haynes. I thought Haynes outplayed him. I thought he really looked comfortable. It looked like maybe a switch got flipped for him a little bit. Need some clarity there. Geno's doing what he's doing without the luxury of standing back in the pocket and scanning the field, without the luxury of being able to go to his third and fourth option at leisure. He's having to do it quickly. If that offensive line gets better, how much better do you think this offense and Geno Smith can get?
That's also a tough question, Dan, because I sort of start to lean just the way Russ was when he was in Seattle. I just sort of start to wonder if Geno and Russ start to mold their play style to playing behind a bad offensive line, right? Like you watch the way that they play, some of the best plays that they make are when the play is breaking down, right? Like we saw that with Russ time and time again, the way he would extend plays. And then all of a sudden you have Doug Baldwin open 20 yards downfield. He catches it and he's running for a touchdown. And that doesn't happen on script, right? But at the same time, I think every quarterback would be better if they had better protection, right? Like if you have more time to throw, you have a cleaner pocket, you have a better ability to see the timing routes, the way that routes are developing, exactly where you're supposed to catch guys out of their breaks, whereas you might not if you're under pressure.
It's an interesting perspective. Yeah, because he's I think the reason he's taken the next step, the one that I referred to that I thought happened about halfway through last year, was when he changed his internal clock, and that got better. And so maybe you give him too much time and he might go back to some old habits. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's possible. I'm not saying that that's, exactly.
I just want another half second, because I think about one play in particular against the Broncos, his second interception. I mean, the first one was he got hit as he was throwing. It was middle of the field, first play of the game. But his second interception, where he also got hit and it affected his ability to throw, it was hard to tell at the time where he was going with it because the ball wobbled and it fell so short, and there were 3 Broncos there and no Seahawks. But you watch the all-22, and what he was looking for and he was trying to hit was DK running absolutely wide-ass open 50 yards down the field for what would have been a walk-in touchdown.
Right.
A split second there, and that's a touchdown. It changes that first half.
Well, and one of my favorite fan takes, Dan, I'm glad we're bringing this up, is just that Geno holds the ball too long. Okay, it's my favorite one, because you know why you think Geno holds the ball too long? It's because the pocket collapses faster than most other quarterbacks' pocket collapses. So then Geno has to make a play out of the pocket and find an option to throw the ball to. And even with that, he is 5th in the NFL in time to throw. Yeah. So the whole he holds the ball thing, let's just squash that, please. Like, I'm so tired of hearing that take, because it's like, it's both factually and visually incorrect. So let's just squash it now.
Let's look ahead to this weekend before I let you go. News came out today. We're going to be facing a Giants team without Malik Neighbors. And just as a little side note, I tweeted that up this morning. I know some fans get excited about when certain guys are missing. It gives you an easier path to a win. I'm not of that school of thought. I would rather be at our best playing against another team's best. I feel like the Giants aren't going to give us the test that I would like them to give us now, although the fact that they have to turn around and play 4 days later, maybe that's a good thing. They might not even have Devin Singletary. We'll find out today. They're going to try to give him a go with that groin at practice. But the prospects of turning around on a short week, coming off an emotional game like that on Monday, and then knowing what's looming next Thursday, any concern about Sunday's game?
I think there's some concern. I'm not going to get overwhelmingly concerned about it, just because anytime you're playing 3 games in 11 days, football is a very, very physical sport. It's a very, very demanding sport. And not only that, teams play at their best whenever they have a full week of preparation, right? And at this point, Seattle's going the 2 games after the Detroit game without a full week of preparation. They got a long week, right, heading into Monday, and now they have 2 short weeks. So you wonder if they did some crash course stuff, ahead of. I don't think they would have done that before the Lions game. They're so focused on each individual game. But you wonder who's watching what, So I also am of the same school of thought as you, Dan, where I would rather see the best versus the best. I would like to see the best test they could possibly get. I think that Malik Neighbors would have been a calling card victory for Seattle's secondary if they could lock him down. Yeah. Right. And now we're not going to see whether that's going to happen. And I think that the Giants offense is significantly hampered, especially if they're without Singletary. But we'll also have to see how the defense is in terms of getting healthy, right? We don't entirely know all of these guys, whether they're going to play. I think that I'm very encouraged by, this sounds terrible. I wish Tyus Bowser the best, but Tyus Bowser departing from the practice squad tells me that they're pretty optimistic about some of these edge guys getting back.
Sure.
We don't know that for sure, but I think that there's a good possibility of that. Offensively, I think that Seahawks offense is miles above New York's defense. The biggest thing is New York's pass rush, right? Kayvon Thibodeau, Brian Burns. That's a legitimate duo. It's one of the best duos in the NFL. So that's going to be the tough task. But as we've talked about all episode, Geno's pretty good at getting away from those guys. So,
yeah, and interestingly enough, Burns with just 1 sack so far. On the season. Thibodeau, I think, has 1.5. But Dexter Lawrence looming there in the middle. He's got 3, and he's a load. I look at Sunday's game in this light. I think it might be the most important game this team plays all season. because we're going to find out how they bounce back from the disappointment on defense Monday, even though, we know that some guys were missing. I think this team is wired in such a way. I think the guys they have on this team and, again, the way they're wired individually and the way Mike McDonald approaches things, I don't think he's going to let them look ahead. Mm-hmm. I think the message this week is going to be, this is the most important game of the season for us. This is a team they should beat at home in perfect conditions with most of their guys back, regardless of what happens 4 days after that. And, if they come out and play poorly Sunday, then we're going to have some major questions about this team and how long it's going to take for this coaching staff to get a handle on them. But I expect good things because everything that we have come to know about Mike McDonald and his staff and how they approach things and how they prepare, I just don't expect to see anything Sunday other than a step forward.
I agree. And I think McDonald, I think he has the it factor, and that's a very general way to put his sort of expertise and just his ability to coach a football team. But every time you hear him talk, every time you hear him assert what Seattle wants to do, he has always struck me as having the it factor. And I know that I went off on that Locked On Seahawks podcast episode that you were talking about, Dan, on the defense, but they deserved it. That was a terrible defensive performance. You allowed an NFL record of pass attempts without an incompletion to Jared Goff, and you allowed 42 points to be stacked up on you. That's embarrassing regardless of the situation. I don't think it was Mike McDonald's fault. I just expected, even though you have all these injuries, I expected a little bit more out of that scheme and what Mike McDonald would be able to dial up. And so I think that when they're fully healthy, they're going to be one of the best defenses in the NFL. They're going to continue to be that, but we're going to see if the health factor weighs in at all.
It's another one of the reasons that I expect them to play well on Sunday and take care of the Giants, because through the first 3 games, they just, especially that back end, and we saw a bunch of issues there on Monday in that secondary. They just weren't challenged. They weren't facing surgeons. They weren't facing guys that can really beat you downfield and get to their 3rd and 4th read and really put that new scheme to a test. Well, now they've seen it. They've seen it up close. They've been burned by it, literally and figuratively. They get a chance to go back, watch the tape, be taught, whatever, and come out against a better quarterback. Like, it's, say what you want about Daniel Jones. He's better than Bo Nix right now. He's better than Jacoby Brissett. He's better than Skylar Thompson or Tim Boyle, certainly. It's going to be a better test than those guys saw. What's your favorite thing about Mike McDonald so far?
Oh, I'm going to have to think on that one for a second.
I'll give you mine while you think.
Yeah, please do.
I appreciate the way he answers questions. And that may sound like a general thing, but more specifically, he pauses to consider his answer almost every time. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's a split-second pause. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 seconds. Whereas, and I try really hard. I hope people don't think I'm ever bashing Pete Carroll, but all we have to compare this staff to is what we've known for the last 15 years. Yeah. And I think it got to a point, I think most people would agree that the messaging just kind of got stale. Mm-hmm. And we knew exactly what to expect from Pete in press conferences, how he was going to answer questions. And he was so quick to answer questions the last several years that it just felt like he had them locked and loaded. Mm-hmm. Right. He just, and here's my automatic response to that. There's a beat that Mike McDonald takes after every question he gets. And I'll tell you too, I've listened more closely to press conferences this year than I have in a while because they're different. Side note, shout out to our media members that cover this team.
They're awesome.
More so than I watch other press conferences that other teams hold. The knowledge and the intellect and the way that they're able to craft questions is outstanding. But anyway, that being said, McDonald will pause and think about how he wants to answer a question. And if he's unsure, he says he's unsure, or he tells you he doesn't have all the information, or he'll just tell you, can't answer that. I don't want to answer that right now. Right. I love that transparency, and I just love that the way his wheels turn.
Yeah. I think an extension of that and it kind of came to me whenever you were just talking about that, is that I think he's very obsessed with excellence, right? He shows it in the way that he talks about the loss post game. It's constantly, it's not up to our standard, right? It's not up to our standard. And he's instilled that in his coordinators too. Adam Durde talked about that. It's not up to our standard. And I think that, to your point, Dan, was somewhat lost in the 14 years of Pete Carroll's coaching tenure. Because I think at one point Pete Carroll was the same way. And not to say that he lost that necessarily, because he was still Pete Carroll. But you had the same system for so long. You had so many different guys come in through those doors. You had so many of the guys that had initially really soaked into, officially gone, right? Like Bobby Wagner ended up being the last one there last year, and he even had obviously a year in LA prior to that.
Yeah.
It just feels like, and everybody was so mad about the way Mike McDonald took down the pictures and, did all this stuff and all that. And it's like, look, it's a new coach. It's a new regime. He is going to bring in his system. He is going to bring in his philosophies. He is going to try and weave them into the fabric of the organization. And the only way he can do that is by taking down some of the stuff that has lived there for the last 14 years. And I think that the way that he has approached, again, the press conferences, the questions that have come his way since the loss, and even whenever they were winning, right? He never seemed satisfied. He never seemed satisfied. He never came in there all giddy to the press conference with a big smile on his face saying, "We won a football game." It was like, yeah, we did some good things. We need to get better, right? Like that's always the way that it was. And so that gives me a lot of confidence that he's going to continue to only build this group up. They're never going to get satisfied. And I think that's really, really important if you want to win a Super Bowl.
Well, Connor, it's our first time chatting. I'm really glad that you had the time to hop on the show and chop it up and share your thoughts. Let people know where they can find you on Twitter and what you're working on for All Seahawks.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Connor Benintendi. I know that's kind of a complicated spelling, but just look up Connor J or something, you'll find me. And then at Seahawks on SI, yeah, I'm the deputy editor and writer over there, working with Corbin Smith, and incredible guy, incredible boss, a lot of fun to work with. I've only been over there since the end of May, and I've had an exceptional time since then moving out of local news. So it's been a great time. So appreciate you for having me, though, Dan. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. You're doing a great job. You really stand out there, and I appreciate the work that you do. I'll put those links also, including the piece that just went live today, down in the description so people can check that out. And we'll do this again soon. Thanks, Connor.
Yes, sir. Appreciate you.
All right, man. All right, that's likely going to do it for this week, unless there is some sort of breaking news between now and kickoff on Sunday. Certainly join me after the game. I will be reacting to it live as soon as I can get back here to the studio from the stadium. I'll be watching it, give you my immediate thoughts on how it felt and how it looked in the stadium, get your reaction, your questions, your comments after that game as well. Until then, down in the comments today, yes or no. That's what I want you to type. And then you can expand on it after that. But yes or no in the comments. Do you agree with Connor that Geno right now, today, is the Seahawks best player? Until next time, I'm Dan. Follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. Forever and always, go Hawks.